Hey everyone, and welcome to a brand new video. Tonight we have 10 stories coming out to just a little bit over 2 hours as per usual. I hope you all enjoy them. If you do, please be sure to drop a like rating. Let's do something really high this time. Let's see if we can reach 1,800 likes on this one. I think if everybody took a quick second, we could do it. Subscribing if you are new is also very much appreciated, as I post content just like this all of the time. Anyway, thank you all for the ongoing support. The channel is growing extremely well, which makes me very excited. Sit back, relax, grab a coffee, pack a bowl, whatever it is that you do to relax, and let's get into the stories. Enjoy, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. Up until about a year ago, I was a mortician. Many know that morgues are more of a family business, and it is inherited by family members. My situation was no different, but there were a few rules that had to be followed. Rule number 1, no prepping the bodies from 12 a.m. to 5 a.m. This rule made it to where there was nobody at the morgue past 11:30 at night. On the few occasions that a person arrived at the morgue at those times, the only person who would prepare them would be my grandmother. Nowadays, some morgues no longer have a night shift, and ours follows that suit except with my grandmother. If someone needed to be prepped, she'd be the one to do it no matter the hour of night. Rule number 2. When entering or leaving any room, or even the morgue itself, you are supposed to say hello and goodbye. I never understood this rule, but I never dared to question. Rule number 3, never forget to wear your family protection amulet. This rule was the most important and stressed rule. These amulets were passed down in my family to any who worked at the morgue. My grandmother always said that they protect us from the unnatural world. While I never really had much belief in the unnatural world, I never went against the rules. My grandmother also stressed I had to believe in the amulet so it'd work. For her, I did believe in it a bit. During the time I worked at the morgue, I noticed that I was the only one who ever had stuff happen to them. It was nothing too serious, just the misplacement of an item or my car keys. It never bothered me, and I brushed it off as my family members pulling a prank on me. That was until about 2 weeks before I quit. A person had come in at night past 12 a.m., and my grandmother, who usually prepared them, was in the hospital. No one else who worked there wanted to go, so I did. I know, they sounded highly unprofessional, but everyone in my family stuck to the rules very religiously. I came in and immediately noticed something off about the morgue. It looked the same as it does in the day, but it didn't feel the same. I shivered at the cold that surrounded me, and just focused on getting the person prepped. As I worked, I felt something stare me down, but I never saw anything. Things I needed would get misplaced, and I had to go search for them. This made it take longer to get done. By 3 a.m., I had finally finished. I placed the body in the refrigerated mortuary cabinet and got ready to leave. I was walking back to the lobby when the lights shut off. They came back on after about 3 minutes, and the morgue now looked more old and run down. I tried looking out the window, but it was completely black. No sign of the street lamp. It was almost like an alternate version of itself. I felt sick to my stomach and brushed the thought aside as I hurriedly headed for the door. I tried to open it, but it was locked. I kept turning it until I heard the sounds of nails scraping against the wall behind me. I turned around slowly, and there stood a humanoid entity. There wasn't much I could see of it since it was covered in a swirling black mist. With it came the smell of death and sulfur. I gagged at the smell. It started walking closer, scraping its nails against the wall. I tried the door again, but it wouldn't budge. Feeling hopeless, I grabbed the amulet and started praying. It laughed. "That won't work. You don't truly believe." Its laugh and voice were awful. like metal being crushed together, and it sounded like multiple people were speaking at once at different octaves. As it passed by the windows, they cracked and shattered, spraying me with the glass. I began to cry as I felt like my life was going to end. I held the amulet tighter and prayed harder. It rushed at me and grabbed me. "Like I said, that won't work. You're in my world now." I struggled through the fear and sobs. "What do you mean?" "This place has been a portal to hell before it was ever a morgue. Why do you think there were these stupid rules?" It laughed. I had turned completely cold. It raised its clawed hand up and stabbed into my stomach. I shuddered as I felt the pain burn through my body. I felt my body go limp as I passed out. When I woke, I was where I was previously, but the morgue looked the same as it does in the day. It no longer looked run down and off. There were no signs of that entity, just the shards of glass on the floor. I went to get up, but a sharp pain shot through me. I looked down, and on my stomach were 3 claw marks seared into my skin. My skin was a weird charcoal black color, and it smoldered where the entity had stabbed me. The glass from the windows was embedded into my arms as well. Slight blood trickled from some of the cuts, but they were nothing compared to nasty seared black scars on my stomach. I got up and went into the lobby. I checked the clock and it was 5:01 a.m. I had been out for about 2 hours. I quickly got my car keys and left. When I got home, I first cleaned my seared stomach and wrapped it, and then pulled the embedded glass from my arms. I cleaned the cuts and wrapped them and went into my room and fell asleep on my bed. After that, I was sick for 2 weeks. When I was sick, I refused to see any of my family members. I didn't know how they would react if they knew I had gotten sick after I had gone to the morgue after 12 a.m. My grandmother had recovered, and she was the one who tried to contact me the most. The 3 claw marks were still on my skin. They looked like black burn scars. I could barely sleep at night from the recurring nightmares of that entity. Once I felt better, I visited my grandmother and told her I was quitting. She didn't ask any questions, and it almost seemed like she already knew why. The only thing she said was, "When you are ready, I'll listen." I left her house in tears. I'm sure she knew I had an encounter with that entity. Did she ever encounter it, or did her belief keep her safe? I didn't know the answer, but I am convinced that the entity was the reasoning for the weird rules at the morgue. About 3 months ago, I told my grandmother what had happened, and she consoled me and placed what she called a protection prayer over me. After everything that happened, I hold a strong belief in the unnatural world, or the unseen world, or whatever you want to call it. I still have night terrors very often, and suffer from insomnia due to the night terrors, but I'm getting help with that. Stay safe out there, people, and don't assume that everything is as it appears. On my front lawn is a bed of flowers near the curb. Last week I wanted to teach my 5-year-old daughter how to use the hose so she can help with chores around the house. But I knew it'll be hard as she has a habit of not paying attention. I turned on the hose and showed her how it was done with turning the faucet and spraying it. Then I turned the faucet full blast and loads more water shot out, and just when I was done saying how to hold it at full blast, she started whimpering. "Daddy!" she screamed. I turned off the hose and asked what was wrong. "What is it? Don't tell me you're scared of the hose." "It's scary. I'm scared," she cried, tears streaming down her scarlet face. "It's only water. You can't drown in it." But she ran inside and slammed the door as if a tiger was chasing her. I shook my head. Next day I was doing the job again, knowing it wasn't worth making her do it, and I saw her staring at me through her window and ducked as soon as I turned the water on. I just didn't know what the hell was up with her. I wonder how good of a parent I've been over these years. When my wife called me from her bedroom window, "Hey, you gotta see this. I've seen something really damn weird. I don't know what it is." I went inside and up to our bedroom, and she was looking at our front house security camera on her computer. She showed me the footage of me hosing recorded on many days, including the day where my daughter freaked out. In the video, while I was focusing on controlling the hose and facing the flowers, my daughter wasn't looking at me or the spraying, but rather the excess water spilling onto the road. I knew her lack of attention paying was going to result from trying this. But then my eyes traveled away from my daughter as she stood still in the footage, and I looked at what she was looking at instead. In the drain grate, where all the water was escaping, I saw something. I saw it too, in all recordings whenever you watered the flowers, my wife told me. My wife zoomed in on it, and the quality got grainier but still clear enough to make out something. From between the bars of the grate squeezed out a foot-long black rubbery object. It gently swayed from side to side like a snake. Its only notable features was some kind of clear opening at the top. It arched downwards and appeared to slurp all the excess water through the opening. Within, we could see small white square-shaped objects and a reddish-pink object that looked flat and wide. It was like a mouthful of teeth and a tongue that a human would have. After about 5 seconds of drinking the water, and my daughter panicking, the shape shot down the drain, vanishing as unexpectedly as it arrived. For context, I am a radio mechanic. I fix radios for a living. I own a radio shop where customers can order a replacement radio, or have a broken one fixed in complete mint condition. Oftentimes, these would be radios that belong to cars that just so happen to malfunction in unknown circumstances. For the most part, it would be water damage or a loose wire which would require just a simple fix. Most of my customers are elderly folk who just so happen to own a vintage radio. Vintage radios are as timeless as they come. The antique finish on the wood to the marble-like finish on the plastic film that enveloped the radios back in the 90s. Oh, to see the look on the customers' faces when they can tune into their favorite radio station and listen intently, turning up the volume and going about their day. Nothing particularly too bad about the job. One night, a strange aura had surrounded the shop, and I had this unquenchable thirst in my throat. It felt like I had been dunked in ocean water despite not having been to the beach in a few years. I brushed it off as a slight fever, though the taste was foreign. Maybe this job is getting to me, I said to no one in particular. It was approaching December. The winter was the worst. It's easy to hear phantom sounds, especially when you're surrounded by voices coming in sudden waves of static. It's not that comforting to hear voices when you're alone in a shop at night, however. I wouldn't say I am unable to handle it, though. Most voices on the radio are discernible as long as the signal is in good condition. Everything around me had always been in good condition. An older gentleman, dressed in a military navy, possibly freshly ironed, suit with a sailor's hat had come up to me. He reeked of bitterness and the desperate longing of a life that was once known. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" I asked politely. "It seems that this darn radio won't catch a damn signal." He heaved with a thrush breath. Actually, I would call it more of a thrush breath combined with a sweet stench of whiskey. How odd. He spoke of a radio not receiving a signal, but the device he brought in was a transmitter. The transmitter he brought in was of a tactical style, dating back to the era of the 1900s. Of course, it didn't receive any signals. It wasn't even designed for that. Noticing my nose crinkle up, the older gentleman intuitively noticed my hesitation before proceeding to utter another sentence. "Don't mind the smell, son. It's a little cold out." I looked at him with a puzzled gaze. Of course I knew what whiskey was. I had a few bottles back in my cabinet in my apartment myself. Was this man possibly making a mockery of me due to my age? Nevertheless, I firmly grasped the radio transmitter in my hand, feeling the rough texture of the metal in the soles of my fingertips. Dust and metal bits had embraced my palm as I delicately put it back down on the counter. "Fancy models here. You make them yourself?" asked the old gentleman curiously. It seemed like he didn't recognize the models on the wall. I doubt that he truly did not know, and it may have been just another role-playing question. Still, I decided to just play along with it. "These models here are brand new. State-of-the-art technology. You won't find any place with radios like this," I exclaimed. I'm not much of a marketer myself, but pride can come a long way when you own a store. Something was off about this particular customer, though. I doubt he would be coming back. He seemed a little puzzled, a little amused, as if my words were a marketing ploy rather than the truth. I don't usually get a customer right smack dab in the twilight of the day. I don't usually get older gentlemen who like to roleplay like they were sailors from the 1900s often. I don't discriminate. It just occurred to me that this was not an ordinary sight. Examining the transmitter closely, it was quite simply a classic case of waterlogging. Perhaps spilled tea, or perhaps it fell in the toilet. Classic. It was such a simple fix. I gestured over to the man and told him I could get it fixed and returned at the same time tomorrow. The man looked pleased with himself and just left the store without any mention of payment. I would have said something, however it was time to go to bed, and the thought of ushering a frail gentleman on his payment at such a late time in the day rubbed me the wrong way. I thought better to just bill him tomorrow. The bell on the top of the door usually had a little chime ring as the customer left the store, but this time there was just no sound, like a crack had been heard in the dead of the night. A little off, I should admit, but I thought better to think nothing of it. Unbeknownst to me, the waterlogged transmitter had started to groan with static. I found it odd, however not impossible, since it happens with the electricity mixes with water. Something really, really strange happened, though. The groaning static became a moan, a moaning static. It's hard to believe simple static could have humanistic qualities, but it grew a bit harsh, almost like it was crying. There was no voice behind it. It's a transmitter, so it obviously wasn't receiving signals. The pattern of the static mimicked that of a person who had a lump in their throat struggling to get the words out. The static created such a frequency that I instantly froze when it started to cry in desperation. Wait, no radios can't do that, can they? Almost like it was turning off and on, pausing and repeating, the motion of the sound waves of the static going up and down, like a baby who had decided to interrupt their mother at 3 a.m. because they need a good tummy rub. Yeah, that kind of crying. Maybe I was losing my mind. I wasn't prepared for this kind of thing. What kind of transmitter did that old man bring to me? Suddenly, my head turned towards a static-like rumbling coming from one of the newer radios. These radios were the kind that modern-day cars would use. It's in mint condition. It wasn't supposed to have that kind of sound unless the signal was incredibly bad. The static noise went on for a few minutes until I finally heard the sweet noise of modern society. I was relieved and a tad bit embarrassed to be in such a fright in my own store. Just as suddenly as my relief came on, it went away as the calmness of the noises I heard had suddenly been pushed to a screeching halt. A static screech, if you will. The screech transformed the sound the radio had been playing to a sound that belonged to a man in desperation. I heard a familiar voice. "This is is Harrison. Do you copy?" What the hell? I whispered in a shocked tone. It was that old man's voice. Was he playing tricks on me? Or... oh god, I am really starting to lose it, aren't I? Just then, Another voice came. It wasn't the old man's voice, it sounded like an acquaintance of his. What he said, it was state-of-the-art technology. I could tell that they were mocking me for what I recited earlier. I don't know who they were or what prank they were pretending to play, but it wasn't funny at all. I suddenly jolted to a loud banging that was being received through the radio. It was accompanied with what I believed to be sounds of thunder and ocean waves. The banging got increasingly louder and louder and louder. Whatever it was, it sounded like they didn't want it coming in. I really didn't understand the prank they were intending to pull on me. If they were intending to scare me, they were nothing more to me than just a few teenage dirtbags in the bodies of old men. I heard one last voice until it was suddenly shut off. Oh God, it's outside. Why isn't this working? I was frustrated. What a terrible prank, I thought. Looking around to collect my belongings and drive home, I felt that ocean water in my throat again. I was going to seriously start crying if I didn't leave right then and there. Before I could slip my way past the entrance and leave, I heard a blaring static coming from every radio in the shop. A blazing hum replaced the static before being replaced by an even stranger sound, coming from every radio. A heightened static screech was accompanied by 3 letters akin to something that would be received by transmitters in the 1900s. S. O. S. Before I could hear the last of it, I sprinted to my car, turned the ignition keys, and felt relief as the sensation of my throat had disappeared, replaced by the familiar air of the city. The city, away from the beach, away from the oceans. Seriously, if I had to feel that stench in my throat again, I would vomit everywhere. Returning to my post tomorrow morning, the familiar sight of the radios had soothed me. Perhaps last night was something akin to a fever hallucination. I mean, those do happen, right? I came to my senses and starting my job of fixing radios again. That's when I reached the transmitter that had been given to me by that old man. I felt really frustrated at the prank he decided to pull yesterday, but alas, I had to complete my job nonetheless. I heaved a sigh of relief as I returned it to mint condition. The transmitter could now transmit audio signals to modern radio technology. The old man returned at the expected time. He looked pleased to see me despite the fact that I wore a slight scowl on my face as he walked in. Again, the bell on the door didn't chime, just a sudden thud as the door closed behind him. As he reached in his pants to shell out a payment, I interrupted him with a simple but assertive question. Why did you prank me yesterday? I asked him, a stern stare in my gaze. Excuse me? He asked, confused. I don't recall doing such a thing. He replied. You know what? Forget about it, I exclaimed. I didn't want to get into a conflict this late at night. The old man smiled and gave me his payment, making a sudden remark on how expensive the repair service is. He was pleased to hear that his radio was in mint condition and was able to transmit to newer devices. I was a bit hesitant for him to leave my store again in anticipation of the prank that may be awaiting me later on tonight. As he left, a folded piece of paper had fell from his pocket and lay on the ground. The old man left, the door heaving closed with just a sudden thud. The old man had gone, but he forgot possibly an important document. Picking it up, I unfurled it and read the contents apprehensively. Dearest Rosemary, I write this to you in preparation for my new occupation as a lighthouse worker. My bags have been packed and I am ready to embark on an exciting new chapter in my life. The sights that one sees out in the ocean cannot compare to the beautiful rose-colored skin that await when I return. I will be accompanied by 2 other gentlemen as we guide the sailors to their destinations. I am writing this letter in the event that if I do not survive or make it out alive, one of my acquaintances will deliver this letter to you. I love you. Rob Harrison, December 1st, 1900. My throat sunk to my stomach. I've had this account for a little while, and I've never posted anything, because I never really thought anything was worth the effort. But I was telling a friend this story tonight, and they suggested I share it to someone who can help me figure out what it was. I live in New England, if that helps. A few years ago, the summer after my senior year of high school, I was sitting outside around 2 a.m. when my then boyfriend, we were smoking weed on his porch, catching up about our day. We both worked night shift, so this was about our 7 p.m. equivalent for those who are on day shift. We were both starting to feel it, the conversation trailing off, just looking out at the driveway. He lived in the woods just off a highway, somewhere where enough people passed to feel like civilization wasn't too far, but secluded enough for privacy, and never knowing your neighbors. On the far end of the driveway there was a small patch of bushes on the edge of the tree line. Behind them was a tree that stood out a bit. If you were familiar with it, it would catch your eye. It was like a focal point in the tree line. I was staring off into space at it, and I noticed movement. As my eyes focused back in, I saw something slowly moving behind the tree from one side to the other. Like whatever it was peering at us from either side, slowly switching back and forth. It was pretty tall, definitely taller than the average person, and I knew I could make out the shape of head and shoulders. The porch light was on, and the tree line was at an incline, so by all accounts it was lit well enough to know if something was moving. I started to feel anxious and sick to my stomach. I didn't want to make my boyfriend nervous too. We were both high and have anxiety disorders. So I slowly turned to him and noticed he's looking the same direction I was. Maybe he didn't notice though. At least I hoped. I quietly and calmly suggested we go back inside. Without questioning it at all, he says, "Yeah, let's go in." For context, this kid adored being outside. He would find any excuse to sit outside, day or night, rain or shine. He loved winter sports and skateboarding in the summer. He loved hikes and he loved to stargaze. He would spend so long outside he'd come back in with new colonies of freckles all over his face and arms, smiling like a kid coming back from a water park. So for him to just agree to go inside without so much as an, "Aw, are you sure?" was out of the ordinary. We go back inside and sit on his bed in complete silence. After a few minutes, he says, "Do you wanna watch some TV, maybe?" I turn back and say, "I'm sorry. I know we are both high and it's probably just my imagination. I'm not trying to freak you out, but did you see that thing behind the tree?" "Yeah." He just stared at the foot of his bed for a good 10 seconds before smiling. "It was probably just the wind pushing around a baby tree. Those poor things can't hold their own." With that, he grabbed the remote and flicked on the movie we had started before going outside. He reached for my hand, laying down and squeezed it tightly. He was trying to distract me. He knew I was scared. I had to be home before 5 a.m. to be up in time for lunch with my mom. He knew I had to drive home in a few hours. My car was parked 5 feet from the bush patch. I tried to relax, just trying to enjoy my high. We were safe inside, a cute movie on, blankets and stuffed animals. I couldn't have asked for anything more, except maybe snacks. Munchies will get you good. But then it came time for me to go home. It was around maybe 3:30 to 4 a.m. by then, and I had to leave. My drive was around a half hour, and I still needed to shower before bed. I packed my work clothes in my bag and get ready to say goodbye. I was standing at his bedroom door giving the usual, "I love you, I'll text you when I'm home," speech everyone gives when he grabbed my hand and told me to drive safe. I assured him I would, but he lifted my face with his fingers and said, I know, but I really mean it. I'm worried. I know I worry, but seriously, if you don't want to drive, don't. I can wake you up early to be home to see your mom. I'll tell my mom you fell asleep during the movie. Something feels off. I told him he was very sweet, but that I was perfectly fine to drive. I wasn't super tired, and my high wore off. I wish I listened to him and just stayed the night. I wish I just slept there and drove home the next day. I wish I didn't step foot outside his front door until morning. God, why didn't I just sleep there? The second my feet hit the porch, I knew someone or something was watching me. It wasn't anxiety. I knew this feeling. I had been followed home from school. I had been followed to the rec center as a kid. I had been followed in stores as a teenager. I knew when someone was watching me, and I knew it in that moment. I tried to brush it off, warm the back of my neck with my hand and do my breathing exercises, but it didn't matter. Every step I took towards my car, towards the tree line, the weight of dread built in my stomach. It made my legs weak and my hands shake. It wasn't fear, it was a feeling of doom. Why on God's green earth didn't I just go the fuck back inside and say I couldn't drive home? When I got about 10 to 15 feet away from my van, I unlocked it and booked it to the driver's side door, which thankfully was facing away from the bushes. I locked my car again and started. My speakers connect to my phone, playing Sublime's Waiting for My Ruka. Everything is fine. You're in your car, music is playing, most of your drive is on the highway. You'll be home and in bed before you know it. I pull out of his driveway and that feeling of being watched doesn't go away. I'm getting really scared at this point, but something in me was calmly telling me to just act natural. Pretend everything is fine. Go ahead, sing along. You love this song. Don't think about it, just look at the road and nowhere else. It's okay, just watch the road. I get out onto the highway, and then out onto the main stretch of road leading to my house. As I turn, that voice in my head goes from calm to stern, like short commands or instructions. Unbuckle your seatbelt right now. Do not look behind you. Do not look in your mirror. Do not show fear. It's like those thoughts weren't my brain. They came from my bones, from something deep and old, much older than me. So, like any reasonable person would do, I unbuckled my seatbelt and rubbed my stomach, grimacing as if I had a stomach ache. Gotta sell the story. I have a reason to be taking off my seatbelt. Tears silently streaming down my face, I mouthed along to the songs playing, giving half-hearted taps on my steering wheel to the beat. And good God, did I do everything in my power not to look behind me. But it wasn't enough. A car passed me with their high beams on. As I looked over to the side of the road, shielding my eyes, I caught a shadowy figure in the mirror. It was blocking half of my back window on my side of the van. It was like it was absorbing the light, like vibrating dark matter. The second I made any contact, that split-second glance, it was enough for it to get back inside my head. It showed me exactly how I was going to die. Like a sick movie playing behind my eyes, I saw myself screaming, swerving off the road and crashing into a telephone pole. My head hit the steering wheel as I rocked back in my seat. It jumped over the head of my seat, ripping my throat open with its claws and eating me alive. I saw my blood pouring into my lap, and then it was over. I felt every second of it, heard every thought I had. What was the last thing I said to my mom? Who was I? Because whatever I was, this was it. Who am I leaving behind? What was the last thing I said to my mom? Why did you pick me? What are you? What was the last thing I said to my mom? I snapped back to the road, looking around frantically trying to get my bearings back. And then I realized that telephone pole was 1.5 miles up the road. I was trying to slow my breathing. I couldn't speak or scream even if I wanted to. I was completely paralyzed. My body was on autopilot as my brain frantically tried to think of a way out, but all I had was, do not show fear. Do not show fear. Do not show fear. In that moment, my boyfriend called me. I answered the phone trying to sound as normal as possible, but I came across forcefully cheery, my voice clearly shaking. He told me he got bored and decided to call. I was so relieved to hear his voice, but I was also confused. I knew him better than the back of my hand, and this didn't make sense. 15 minutes ago, he was deeply concerned about me driving home. Now he's bored. When he concerns himself with something, he can't let go of it for hours sometimes. At best, he would feel better when I made it home. But for him to be bored halfway through my drive, it was so unlike him, and furthermore, nothing he was saying made sense. Idly discussing random topics like what his shower routine was, which I knew. Why was he explaining it to me? Whether or not he should floss tonight. I've never once seen that kid floss. He despised the taste of blood and would never willingly floss. And most notably, explaining the concept of Forza. That was when I got the message. For anyone who isn't aware, Forza is some dumb racing game we would often play together, trying to beat each other's times until we eventually devolved into seeing how recklessly we could drive without letting the car hit a dead stop, pinned between rocks or at the bottom of a lake. He was explaining the concept of a game we were both familiar with to let me know he knew I wasn't free to talk. He was talking to make it known that I wasn't alone. He was listening and he wasn't hanging up. For the rest of my drive home, we made stilted, casual conversation. I saw the telephone pole coming up. My entire body tensed. I was white-knuckling the wheel. I was going to make it past this fucking pole, or so help me God, I would have started a riot at Hell's Gates. I slowed down gently, trying to seem as calm and fluid as I possibly could. As I passed, something in the air changed in my car. Once again, it was showing me something behind my eyes. Without looking behind me, I saw it standing next to the telephone pole. It knew I escaped. It wasn't just dumb luck. It was showing me where I should have died. It was watching me drive away, telling me, "You were lucky this time." When I turned onto my street, I wept out of relief. My car was barely off and in park before I flung myself out of the car. The no seatbelt sounded so stupid until that moment, and I ran inside the house and locked the door behind me. I just sat on the floor against my front door sobbing on the phone with him. At this point, he broke down too. I didn't notice for a moment until he said, "Jesus Christ, I thought I was going to have to hear you die. I love you so much." He kept repeating how much he loved me, sobbing over the phone with me. I caught my breath enough to ask him what he meant, because I hadn't told him anything yet. In my head, I thought I looked like a maniac. I was just driving home like normal, and then started hysterically crying for seemingly no reason. As far as I was aware, I wasn't entirely sure he even called to protect me. I was doubting myself that maybe he really did just want to discuss Forza of all things for 15 minutes straight. None of it made any sense. He calmed down a little and told that right before he called me, he saw a terrible image in his head of the front end of my van wrapped around a telephone pole, my neck nearly missing, and my dead eyes just staring out my window at him. So he called me. When I answered, he knew something was very, very wrong. He knew he had to act natural and pretend everything was fine. He looked around the room for talking points and stuck to Forza. I cried and told him everything, begging him to believe me. Of course, he did, but it felt so unreal that I wasn't sure I even believed it happened. I've spent my whole life running from death. I wasn't supposed to be conceived. I almost died twice, during and after birth. I was supposed to be disabled physically and mentally. I turned out physically fine, and aside from high-functioning autism and a slew of mental illnesses, I'm alright. I've been stalked. I've almost been kidnapped a few times. I've been hit by a car once. I slid off the road into a guardrail the winter before, an accident that should have been fatal, but all I had was a concussion and some bruising. I've taken drugs that were laced. I've been given drugs that were just straight up not what I was told they were. I've almost drowned. The list goes on. Anytime I thought I was for sure, no doubt going to die, there was almost a sense of peace. A bit of an, I understand, if this is how it ends, so be it. I'm tired of running, feeling. But this was something cold and desperate, and it wanted to crawl inside my skin. It was powerful, but for some reason it let me go. This was something I would never accept. I lay awake at night wondering if it knows me. If it was in my head, what did it learn? Is it still after me? Has it found me yet? And god damn it, what was the last thing I said to my mom? P.S. My ex and I are still in contact. Upon asking if he remembers this, he told me that night was the single most amount of fear he's ever felt, and recounted his side for me again so I got it right. We came up with a code I can call him with if I ever encounter this thing again. It's, hey, I was supposed to come pick up my copy of Forza yesterday. Do you mind if I swing by to grab it? I was working at the police station when I checked the local newspaper. The headline immediately caught my attention. Patients went missing from the hospital. The article mentioned that a few patients who were close to dying went missing, and nobody knows what happened to them. The first case was recorded 2 months ago, and the most recent one happened yesterday. The nurses can't find them, and all of them were dying so they couldn't escape the hospital. My wife also worked there, so I called her. "Yeah, we have no idea what happened to them," she said. "We've checked every corner of the buildings." I got home around 7 p.m. My wife was already home. She usually got home a few hours before me. As I was looking for lunch, she came upstairs from the basement. "What were you doing down there?" I asked. "I put some old broken chairs there," she responded. "I'll probably renovate the whole basement soon." "Why?" I raised my eyebrows. Since we moved there, we hadn't used the basement. It was strange. There was nothing interesting down there, just a few spiders. "Why not? I have nothing better to do." I finally agreed. The following day, I went to work again. We've got a call from the hospital to go there and investigate the missing persons because their families want answers to what happened to them. I drove there with Mark, another police officer. Dr. Martin, one of the doctors, told us every information about the missing patients. He even showed us where we could find their beds. It was in the same room my wife worked in. She was home at the time. She didn't work on Fridays. It seems like all of the patients were really close to the hospital's back door. Mark said to Dr. Martin and me, "What if they escaped there?" "Impossible." Dr. Martin shook his head. "All of them were on their final days. They couldn't walk, and we hadn't found any strange footprints leading out the back door. There is also the whole parking lot. Somebody would have seen them if they escaped there." "What if someone smuggled them out?" I theorized. It seems like all the missing patients were close to the back door. Something could drag them to the parking lot and drop them in the car. "But who?" Dr. Martin asked. It was a fair question. Who could have done that, and why? "I have no idea," I responded. My wife also works here and hadn't noticed anything strange. "We will speak to the staff here next week," Mark said. "Make sure that everyone will be here." After that, we went back to the police station to write some reports, then spoke about it to our boss. I arrived home at the usual time but didn't find my wife. I heard strange noises from the basement and wanted to go down there. But then she came upstairs. "Hi," she greeted me. "So, are you working on that basement?" I asked. She looked strange. I thought I saw a small amount of blood on her face. "Do you need any help?" "No, I can do it alone." "Are you sure? I can help. I'll be home the whole weekend anyway." Thanks, but I'll handle it. What are you doing down there? We don't need that basement that much. Stop asking me so many questions. She shouted at me, frustrated. I was surprised. Sorry, I'm tired. Look, just don't go down there, please. She said in a calmer tone, then went to sleep. The following day quickly went by. She was in the basement almost all the time, and I was reading some books. She then told me she was going to the market to buy some food. After she left the house, I came out of my room and went to the basement door. It was strange as I still heard some noises coming from below. I was curious. I opened the door and looked down the stairs. I only saw darkness, so I used my phone to illuminate the narrow halls. I slowly walked down the stairs. The noises were getting louder. After about 20 steps, I arrived there. I immediately regretted it. There were some steel cages inside, and in every cage, there was something I can't even name. Old, rotten bodies. Some of them looked like the missing persons from the hospital. I froze as I couldn't know what to do. And the worst wasn't the fact that the bodies were there. They were moving. Their eyes were white. One of them grabbed the cell's door with his rotten hand. I finally ran back to the stairs, trying to get out of there as soon as possible. At the top of the stairs, there was my wife standing with angry eyes. I told you not to go there, she said slowly. What the hell are you doing down there? I shouted at her. What are those things? These are the patients that went missing. I'm going to be the greatest scientist ever known, she responded. Her voice was confident. I felt like I didn't know her. I stopped death itself. I saved those patients from death. I had no idea what to do, so I just tried to run out of there, pushing her aside, but as I was trying to push her, she bit my finger. I screamed because of the pain, but tried to run out anyway. I looked down at my hand, and one of my fingers was missing. I ran up to the bathroom, then locked the door behind me. Don't hide from me, she shouted from outside. You should be proud of me. I'll save humanity. As she was shouting, I found some bandages to stop the bleeding from my finger. She kicked the door multiple times, then stabbed it with a kitchen knife. My only chance was to escape out the window. I opened it, then crawled outside. The only problem was that the bathroom was on the floor. I had to jump. The pain in my legs was horrible as I fell to the ground. I immediately called Mark to get to my house in his car. He then took me to the hospital to patch me up. The following day, I told them and the police what happened. Yeah, we figured there was something wrong, Mark said. Your house burned down last night, just after I brought you to the hospital. The firefighters found the bodies you were talking about, but your wife is missing. We have no idea where she is. I don't know how long it's been. I can't remember. Long enough for our porch to sink into the sand, the wood bleached like half-buried bones. Long enough for the loneliness to stick to me like a second skin. Long enough for us to rot. I can't remember anything clearly anymore, except for her. Tanaya loved the sea. She lived for it, dragging me out to her family's remote beach house almost every weekend to bask in the frigid salt of the waves. She said she'd always wanted to bring a girlfriend to her little house by the sea, and the way she said it made me feel like the luckiest girl in the world. It almost made up for the long, winding drive and spotty cell service. Almost. I didn't share her love for the ocean. To me, it was a distant acquaintance at best. Too cold, too vast, too unforgiving. But I loved the way the sun glinted off the waves and onto her smile, how vibrant she became every time she entered the surf. It was dark the night it happened, but clear. We were out on the porch, her with her arms outstretched, the wind making sails of her clothes, me off to the side huddled in layers of woolen blankets. The air was sharp and fresh, peppered with sprays of salt and sand that entered every corner of our beings. She turned toward me then, utterly alive with it all. "I'm going to go in." The parts of her voice not blown away by the wind were giddy. "Are you sure? It's late and the water is going to be freezing." "It always is. Just for a quick dip. And then we can watch that awful movie you've been dying to show me." My forehead creased as I looked out at the dark, shivering ink that made up the waves. "Be careful. I'll keep watch." She turned and leapt off the porch, sprinting towards the line of the water, not bothering to see if I was following. I jogged after her, still wrapped up in wool, and stopped about 10 feet from the waves. I watched as she ran into them, the warmth seeping out of me like a leak in a glass. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, until I was shivering there, the wet sand making prunes of my feet. Tanaya was a pale blur as she dove into the waves and surfaced again and again, gasping as she broke the surface. Water poured off of her, sticking her hair to her face, tangling it in her smile. I looked down and watched the waves play tag with the shore. They flowed in and out and left trails of shivering, effervescent foam in their wake. I could hear Tanaya laughing. Her delighted voice blew towards me in torn bursts with the wind. And then there was another noise, more like a gasp. I wrenched my gaze upward in time to see her being pulled away from shore. In a movement faster than thought, the blanket was on the sand and I too was in the waves. The cold shocked me into panic as I made my way towards her. My every movement felt too slow, like the water was fighting my progress. Ahead of me I could see her struggling. She was being pulled directly into the waiting arms of a rocky outcropping that stuck out from the shore. The rocks shone slick with salt and malice. In an instant I saw her collide with it, her torso slamming into the unforgiving stone with force. The waves pulled her back and forth, pummeling her into the rocks again and again like a cruel puppeteer. I reached her just as she went under. My hands were desperate and my eyes were open. I could see her blurry form through the salt in my eyes, sinking, almost out of reach. I grabbed onto the rock, ignoring the barnacles that cut into my hands like glass. I used them as leverage and launched myself downwards, managing to grab hold of her arm, pulling her cold body towards me. The waves pushed us down once more, and for a second everything was silent. I could feel the burn of salt water entering my lungs, invading my nostrils and forcing its way down my throat. The trek back was arduous. She was conscious and breathing by some miracle, but I could see blood pouring from her head. It rendered her incapable of swimming correctly. Her movements were jerky and groans of pain escaped her lips. We reached the shore on our hands and knees. I tried to wrap her in blankets, but the wool was soaked through and too heavy to lift. Instead, we stumbled up to the house. Tanaya's movements were growing shorter, more labored. By the time she reached the porch, she was collapsing in on herself, falling as she tried to wipe the blood from her eyes. I half carried her into the house, into our room, onto our bed. I felt delirious. Water had crept into my lungs and it came out of me in sprays when I coughed. My phone, the only one that had been charged, lay inert and waterlogged in the pocket of my shorts. So I lay there with her, held her close and wiped salt water and blood out of her eyes with my hands. I could hear myself saying things I didn't believe. "It'll be okay. You'll be fine. Tomorrow we'll wake up together and everything will be good. We still have to watch the movie, remember?" Tanaya did nothing but gasp. She was so cold. Her eyes were bleary, and they moved in slow circles around the room. Her breathing began to slow, becoming shallower with each labored inhale. Her eyelids drooped. She died at a pace that felt like melting and looked like sleep. I don't know how long I lay there holding her, feeling the last of her warmth seep into the bed and mix with the blood-soaked sheets. Sobs tore out of me in looping wails, becoming more choked as I hold my breath. Felt the fluid build up around the damaged tissues in my lungs. Call it secondhand drowning or call it grief. The result is the same. They found our corpses a week later after we failed to come home, wafting flies and the smell of rotting seaweed. They carried them away, but I can still see us. Still see my desiccated arms curled around her peaceful, damaged corpse. They put up telephone lines near our house recently, as new places have begun to spring up, to help prevent future accidents. If I focus, I can travel just far enough to reach the closest wire. I've been broadcasting this message for weeks now, hoping somehow something will pick it up. I want people to know what happened and how wonderful she was. Maybe if someone out there hears me, they can send help. You see, I don't know where she went when she died, but it isn't here. I can't find her, and I don't know how to leave. Christmas Day was always a special time for me and my family. It was a day for family and togetherness, but most importantly, presents. I always love the feeling of waking up way too early, realizing that it's Christmas Day and rushing downstairs where my presents awaited. But it's always Christmas Day here. I don't know exactly where I am. I've terrorized a lot about where I am. Maybe it's hell or some other plane of existence I can't comprehend. But the most logical explanation is that I'm in some sort of purgatory. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me explain. It started like any other day, except it wasn't any other day. It was Christmas, and I knew that soon my two kids, Max and Taylor, would come rushing in to wake us up. Predictably, that's exactly what happened. I took a few minutes to get up before following our children into our living room with my wife Ashley, not very far behind. I peered into the room to see the giant pile of presents we took a while wrapping just a few hours earlier. The reddish, greenish glow from the lights reflecting onto the drab walls could almost be described as eerie. To be blunt, they made me feel uneasy. The moment both of us came into our living room, our children started shredding into the presents. And before we knew it, the room looked like a tornado had picked up all the presents and ripped them up, leaving a flurry of wrapping paper in its wake. This would suck to clean up. Ashley gave me the look, plainly communicating to me to get some trash bags. I did exactly that, but when I got back I found out that I wouldn't need them. The room was entirely clean. No wrapping paper in sight. But it wasn't empty. I looked over to the couch to see Ashley, Max, and Taylor sitting on the couch, not saying a word. Ashley then beckoned to the seat next to her, slowly opened her mouth and said, "Come sit with us." I'll admit I wouldn't have thought of myself as the first person to go off the deep end, but it wasn't the biggest shocker. If I ever experienced something weird like this, that deep down I knew wasn't right, I would usually just shrug it off, but this, not so much. I started to slowly walk over, but I suddenly snapped out of my trance-like state by my children's laughter. I looked to the ground to see my kids playing with their new toys. I then looked over to Ashley to see her sipping a cup of coffee and watching some bad Hallmark movie. Maybe that didn't happen. No, it definitely happened. Where was the wrapping paper? It was simply gone. I couldn't just shrug this off. Ashley knew something was wrong. When she asked me about it, I just said I hated how all Hallmark movies were so formulaic. She frowned at me, knowing I was lying. I'd never been good at lying. Either that or Ashley was an amazing guesser, but I decided to go with the more likely former. I smiled at her. Just a bad dream. That was technically a half-truth, considering I had no idea what had just happened. That seemed to put her at ease. The rest of the day was spent with my family, talking, laughing. This is exactly why I loved Christmas. Before I knew it, the day was over, and it was time for a new day. I walked back to my bed and fell right asleep. I woke up groggy and disoriented, like most mornings. Our 2 kids came rushing in. It took me a second to realize why that wasn't right. Hey, why are you guys up so early? We usually need to power tools to get the covers off of you. They simply looked at me and shouted, "It's Christmas." My heart skipped a beat. That wasn't right. It was the 26th, right? Had I somehow dreamt everything and that happened? It would explain a few things, but I decided it would bring up more questions than answers. Ashley sat up beside me. We better get into the living room before they make a complete mess of it. I simply got up and emitted a vague sound that I didn't even know the meaning of. It was all the same. They said the exact same things. Even if I said something different than yesterday, it didn't matter. Same response, even if it didn't make sense. And it's not like my family had any reaction to this odd behavior. They didn't do anything. It was like watching a video with slightly more interactivity. The only thing missing from this was the odd experience with Ashley trying to call me over to the couch. It ended the exact same way it did last night. I went to bed, but I didn't sleep right away. In fact, I stayed up till 5, but after that I blacked out. The loop started over again. And it kept going. Loop after loop, the exact same thing. Exact same reactions. It didn't matter what I did, nothing would change. I could scream, I could leave the house entirely and go as far away as possible, but it wouldn't change. I would always wake up in my bed. I don't even seem to age. Even as years go by in this hell that was once my home. I thought that I was trapped for eternity, which if you ask me is worse than death, but something happened. I got my wife to say something different for once. It was completely impromptu. She just started talking normally. Well, not normally. Ashley sounded quite distressed, but it wasn't the same Ashley repeating everything day after day. It's the only thing that's keeping me motivated to not give up. I know that this is only the beginning. I don't even know how to get my real family back. Maybe that's how you solve it. Maybe not. I know Ashley is in there. I know I can save her and my kids. P.S. Oddly enough, I have access to the internet. Even odder than that, this post stays up even after the day resets. I don't know if it's really Christmas Day in the real world because I know that this is not the real world. I was driving my girlfriend home after she got off work one night, and I noticed a man standing under a street lamp on the corner. She saw him too, and we talked about why he was there. Maybe he needed help. We both agreed I should at least check on him, so she got out and gave me a kiss, telling me to be safe before heading up to her apartment. I watched him for a minute. He was looking around quickly, like maybe he thought someone was after him. I felt my gut barking at me to leave him be. He might be crazy or on drugs. He could steal the car or my wallet. For a brief moment we locked eyes and I saw genuine fear, and that made my gut quiet down and my courage rise. I drove over to where he sat and pulled up to the light, rolling down the passenger side window to talk with him. He didn't get up right away. He just looked around for anyone else and gave me a suspicious look. "You doing alright, man?" I said, trying to be as friendly as I could. He ignored me until I heard a dog bark somewhere nearby, and that made him jump like something had poked him between the shoulders. The dog barked a few times more, and I could see the man was in terror. "You want to ride somewhere?" I asked, trying to calm him down. He got up and came to the door without taking his eyes off where the dog had barked. As he got in, I looked him over. His arms were filthy, but no track marks. His face was haggard and his eyes bloodshot, but I didn't smell alcohol on his breath. He was wearing slacks that were worn down at the knees and a crusty gray snow jacket with fur around the hood that had turned to a matted mess the color of a coyote pelt from years of dirt and grime. He wasn't wearing a shirt under it, and his skin was hard and dry like leather, and stretched tight over his ribs. No prison tattoos. He looked a bit more relaxed once he got in the car, and asked with a voice like sandpaper on leather, "Can you take me to the bus station, sir?" I looked at him harshly and said, "Look, man, I'll take you wherever you need to go, but you have to tell me if you have any weapons on you, and if you do, you put them out the window. Understand? The same for any drugs." The man nodded and held out his hands. "I got no weapons and never had no drugs, sir." I looked for any signs of a lie in his eyes, but saw none. As we drove, he began to tell me where he was going. He came from further south, almost 2 states away. "Name's Walker. Been doing that for going on 26 years now. Been all over. Seen some things that'd make you swear off sleep for the rest of your days. Being on the streets is like being a ghost. Some notice you, some are scared of you, but most just ignore you. You become invisible. Living that way will drive anyone crazy after a while because you see people do stuff they'd never do if someone was looking. Funny things sometimes, but mostly bad things. Things that will turn your heart black and poisonous if you let it." He looked out the window. I could only imagine the memories that brought up for him. He talked easily for a man who lived on the streets. There was a fearless resignation to him, and it made me uneasy. As we drove toward the station, I asked him why he came here and where he was heading. He took a deep breath and thought for a moment. "I had to get away from something bad down south. No gangs or cops or nothing, just..." He looked out at the streets, trying to find the words. "I had come off a boxcar near the border of Mexico. Was traveling with a couple others I'd met further west. We went into the town and talked with some of the locals, and they pointed us toward a camp nearby the train yard where we could stay. It was a shanty town under a rail bridge about a 40-minute walk from downtown. There was a half-dozen guys there, and they seemed okay. We found a spot and set up our camp and found out the good spots for food and supplies from the locals. Everything seemed normal until it got dark. There was a communal fire pit at the center of this place. They told us it had to burn all night, that because we was new, we would have to tend the fire for a few nights. When I tried asking about it, they'd beat around the bush or just stop talking altogether. It was Big Bear that noticed the factory was always outside of camp. Big Bear was one of the guys traveling with me. The man was a mountain of hair and filth, but he was the nicest person you could ever meet. He had a laugh that made you want to laugh just by hearing it. Bear brought up the factory to try one of the locals, and they acted like he'd called the devil by name. We had pulled up to a red light, and he stopped a moment looking out at an all-night diner with a kind of hesitant expression. I could see he was hungry, and I wanted to hear what happened to him, so I suggested we stop in for some coffee and a bite to eat before moving on. He looked at me and gave me a sad smile before agreeing with a bashful thanks. After we ordered and got our coffees, he told me about the factory and what supposedly lived there. I seen the place coming in. Looked like a packing plant gone out of business long before I was born. So old there weren't no roads leading to it. At least none you could see. Never would have known it was there unless you were to walk up on it. From a distance, it didn't look like anything but an old building. It was when you got close you started to notice things weren't right. No one in the camp would talk about it. All they said was something bad lived in there, and it was a bad idea to talk about it, or even think about it. Now you come across a lot of superstitions out on the road. The life on the streets is a world of talismans, taboos, and good luck charms. Stuff you never say out loud, or something you carry with you or bury near your camp to keep bad luck away. When you have no control of your world and the terrible things it can do to you, you find ways of controlling it, even if it's bullshit. I reckon people been doing that longer than we've been writing or talking. But this kind of fear, this kind of taboo, was something I'd never seen before. They lived in terror of this place, but they found they could stay out of harm's way by ignoring it. That and keeping the fire going at night. That first night, the three of us took shifts keeping the fire going. I took the first shift, then Glenn took his. Finally, Bear had the last shift before sunrise. The next morning I could tell something was bothering him, so I asked him if something happened. He said he heard sounds coming from that factory. Said they was like animal sounds, but like if a man were imitating them. Couple of times he said it sounded like it was laughing or maybe screaming. He didn't know. He just knew he didn't like it. We rotated the times between us for a few weeks, and it was always the last watch when you'd hear something out there. The sounds reminded me of a lunatic screaming in the night. Lots of folks on the street aren't right in the head, and I've been woken up by one screaming his head off or babbling in the middle of the night. That's what the sounds were like. One time I thought I'd seen eyes shine like an animal in the dark. Sometimes there would be a terrible smell that would drift through. A god-awful smell, and let me tell you, I've been around rot, shit, and garbage, but this was like nothing else. It made you feel smaller, like you was trying to retreat back into yourself to get away from it. It was a wrong smell. That's the closest I ever came to describing it. He shuddered slightly and held his coffee up, taking a sniff as if to chase the memory of that smell away. He shook his head and looked down as he spoke. Glenn took off after a week. Couldn't handle the weirdness. Bear and I stuck around for some damn fool reason. I can't recall what it was, honestly, but we stayed. It was a little while later Bear started acting funny. He was keeping to himself more, and he looked worn, like he might be sick or couldn't sleep. When I asked him what was wrong, he said he's seen something a few nights back. He's seen what lived in that factory, and he said it's seen him too. He'd been hearing sounds like always, but then he heard something closer. A dragging sound. He had to leave the firelight and let his eyes adjust to see it out there in the moonlight, but he's seen it. He said it looked like a pile of rags wearing an old, oily black wig. There was little glints of white hanging off it, and he swore they was bones, small and large. It was dragging a sack behind it, and out the back through a hole a white hand, pure as pearl in the moonlight, was dragging on the ground from inside. That was when the thing looked right at him. Its eyes caught the firelight like an animal and glowed like embers. He felt all the strength run out of him and fell to the ground. He was trying to crawl back to the fire, but it was like he'd been drained. The thing let out a laugh like a coyote call, and that got him moving again, and he made it back to the fire. He said since then he didn't sleep, except a bit during the day. He would hear it sometimes, little yips and barks. The smell seemed to follow him everywhere, and he lost all appetite because of it. Every day he looked worse. I covered his spot, tending the fire at night, but still, he would wake up screaming in his bed if he'd managed to sleep at all. Then one day he was gone. He took a sip of coffee with a shaky hand and shook his head. The guy at the fire said they'd seen him get up and walk out into the dark. No light, no expression, not a word to any of them. Just walked off in the direction of the factory. There weren't no noises that night, or any of the next nights. I tried to get some of the others to help look for Bear in that old factory, but none of them would. Can't blame 'em, really. Can't believe I went myself, but I did. Bear was one of the only decent folks I'd come across out there, and I felt I owed it to him. So off I went. During daylight, of course. God himself couldn't make me go there at night. Other than what put me there in the first place, that was the worst mistake of my life. The building was only half standing. It looked like a Hollywood set, the framework and outer walls giving the illusion of a building with nothing inside. There were little windows at the base that must have led to a basement, and I could see a clear path to and from one of the larger broken panes that must have been where whatever lived there came and went. I looked down into it, but the darkness was as solid as cloth inside, and I went to the front entrance instead. The doors were rusted off the hinges, and a solid metal chain held them to the center frame where they hung like angel wings. Inside was bright and open. the roof having decayed and crumbled over the years. There were huge, rusting hunks of machinery and old meat hooks on long, rusting poles. The stench of the place was overpowering. It was the same wrong smell I'd catch now and then at night, only this was like standing at the source. I had to hold my shirt over my mouth to go any further. That was when I noticed it. It was dead quiet. There wasn't a single bug chirping or bird calling. Even the wind had stopped. The only sound was a dull buzzing like an unseen swarm of flies. As I noticed this, I realized I was standing before an open cell door. The corroded stairs went down into that eerily solid darkness, and all I could see at the bottom was a mass of some god-awful sludge and standing stagnant water, orange with rot and rust. There were bright white bones jutting out of it, and clumps of old sun-bleached fur. Even more confusing, there were scattered around it several white sausage shapes, some floating in the slime and others down at the bottom. I only saw what might have been animal teeth somewhere in the sludge before the smell became so overwhelming I turned and ran, but not before hearing what sounded like clattering bones and someone clicking their teeth together down there. As I ran, my mind was finally able to process that the sausages scattered around down there hadn't been sausages at all. They were fingers. He swallowed hard and looked like he might faint. I called the waitress over for more coffee, looking around the diner to give my mind a break. This was not how I thought this night would go. I thought I'd be doing a man a favor and scoring a few points of karma for myself. Maybe get an interesting story to tell later, but this was different. His story was of course utterly mad, and yet there was no sign of illness or fraud in the old man. I couldn't make sense of it, so I resigned to keep listening. I did end up seeing Big Bear one last time in a way. I was tending the fire one night and I heard him call out to me from the dark. I was surprised as hell to hear his voice again. It sounded just like him. I couldn't see hardly nothing out there, but once my eyes adjusted, I seen him. He looked like he was hunched over, just beyond the firelight, wearing the same clothes he wore all the time. Only they were stained black with something, like he'd been rolling in old motor oil. His face was oddly slack, like he'd been shot with a muscle relaxer. It was his eyes that made me see it wasn't him. They were just dark holes, like little caves, and somewhere deep inside, something caught the firelight and glimmered. I just turned away from him and stared at the fire, ignoring anything I heard from the dark, forcing the fear away by focusing on the fire until morning came. That was when things got worse. That terrible smell followed me everywhere. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think. I started hearing voices. Sometimes it would sound like Bear or Glenn. Other times it sounded like my wife. I hadn't even thought of her in so long. Hearing her voice come out of the dark like that scared me worse than anything. He gripped the coffee mug tightly and looked away with painful embarrassment. That was a long time ago now. I ain't told that story to anyone, but I might as well tell you. Things being as they are. He looked at his hands like a man condemned. I left because I killed my little girl. She was only 2 months. His voice broke as he said it, and I could see his eyes gloss over. Had a house and a wife then. Good wife. God, I miss her. She was an angel. She had a fever, real bad, couldn't stay out of bed longer than a few minutes. How she took care of our little girl before I'd gotten home from work, I'll never know. It was up to me to watch over her, and the little one that night. I fed her, changed her, put her to bed, everything I was supposed to. Once she were asleep, I thought I could relax a little. Got a couple beers and settled down to watch TV for a bit. Just a normal night. He shook his head as though he were trying to shoo away a fly that was bothering him. Well, maybe I had one too many, or maybe I was just dead tired from the day, or maybe I was just a water-headed fool with 2 left hands and no right to the life I had. My girl, my baby girl, she woke up crying and I went to her. Everything was a blur for me. The house felt like we was on a ship in rough seas. I tried to help her, to hold her, but she fell. His voice broke again and he took a couple hard breaths to steady himself. I dropped her. I dropped my baby girl and she hit the floor. God, that sound. He sniffed and tensed as though he were pulling a long splinter. She weren't breathing. She weren't crying no more. I knew she was dead. I held her in my arms and I said I was sorry over and over. I thought about my wife, how she would hate me for what I'd done, how she would scream and cry and curse me until the day I died. I went into full panic. I picked up my little girl and I wrapped her and put her back in the crib. I didn't even take anything, I just ran. I ran until my legs gave out and I collapsed in an alley and screamed myself hoarse. He didn't look at me as he finished his story. He just looked out at the dark streets. Been out here ever since. His voice was steady again. Thought about dying every day, but I ain't earned that. I've been through the ringer. Been beaten, stabbed, raped, starved, sick with anything and everything, and still I ain't suffered enough for what I had done. And now? He trailed off. Wow. That was all I could think to say. He seemed to be thinking hard about something. I'm sorry to ask, but... He shook as if he'd decided something. I didn't come here to catch a bus, you see. This town is where I used to live before all this. I came to see her one last time, to tell her I'm sorry and get some closure, you know? Hell, she may not even live here anymore, but if you could take me there so I could try, well, I'd appreciate it. He looked at me, his eyes still glossy, and I agreed. We agreed to go after he finished his story, and a few more coffees. The dreams that came when I managed to sleep at all, they were the worst. I was always back in that factory looking down into that hole, seeing those fingers scattered around the filth, and then a scream would wake me up, only it was me screaming myself awake. I had to get away from that camp, so I went into town and found a shelter that would have me. Not all shelters are bad, but I'd learned to steer clear of them over the years. You risk getting robbed or worse when you're in a place regular people expect you to be. Better to find your own space away from anyone. But right then I needed to be around regular people. I needed a building with doors and locks. That first night they almost threw me out when I woke up screaming. The next night I woke up with the night guard yelling in my face as I was trying to go out the locked front doors. I tried not to sleep, and every night, the sounds from the factory would ring out in the distance, getting closer it seemed. If anyone else noticed, they wouldn't say anything. I wanted them to put me in a locked room or tie me to the bed, but they just thought I was crazy and offered me rehab or a church. One night I came out of a dream and I was standing in a dark field. I don't know where I was or how I got there. Then I heard the howls and I could see the shape of that factory in the moonlight. Christ, I had almost walked right into it. I turned and ran back to town completely shaken. What made me leave that place and come back here after all this time was a dream. I don't even remember falling asleep. I was just standing in the dark of the shelter looking up at the moon. It looked like the roof of the place got torn off. The place was empty. All the cots full of snoring shapes were gone. All I could see in the blue light of the moon was big shapes of machines. That was when I realized where I was, and I turned around to see the opening to the cellar behind me, like an open mouth pouring out rotten breath. He wiped sweat from his brow. His face had gone a sickly green as he remembered. It was quiet as the grave, just like before, only now there was clattering like bones being dropped or kicked around on concrete coming from that hole. There was a wet slapping sound like meat being tossed and dragged, and beneath all that, what I heard coming from that hole was a low muttered whisper, unintelligible and constant. I felt like I wasn't in my body no more. I saw myself standing at the mouth of that hole, and I saw myself take a step toward it. Everything in me screamed to stop, but I kept walking. The terror was a dull roar that empowered everything except that low whisper. That's when I heard something I can't believe even now. He took a heavy, shuddering breath. I heard a baby crying. My little girl. I know it was her. I'll never forget that sound, and the devil take me if I ever do. I heard my little girl, and it shook me out of my dream or trance or whatever had me. Only I didn't wake up in the shelter. I came back to myself, but I was still there in that place in the dark. I don't have any idea how I got to be there, but the realization almost gave me a heart attack from pure terror. I turned away from that black open mouth and ran. I ran through the dark brush and along the train tracks harder than I ever ran before, and all the time I can hear it barking and laughing behind me, sometimes so close I could almost feel the heat of its breath on my neck. I jumped a train, damn near killed myself doing it, and left. He finished his coffee and seemed to collect himself. At first, I just wanted to get as far away from here as possible. But after hearing my little girl again, even if it were just a dream, I wanted to come back here. Maybe being so close to something so evil made me feel like I had suffered enough. Or maybe getting away from it was a sign I was ready. Maybe after facing something like that, facing my past wasn't so bad. He shook his head like he still couldn't figure out how he came to that decision. After we finished our coffees and he had finished his story, it was getting close to 3 a.m. He looked outside at the dark streets, and for a moment, a look of pure panic flashed across his face. I spun around to look in the direction he was looking, and I saw a dark shape slip out of view in an alleyway. I only saw it for a moment, but I could have sworn I'd seen eyes shine like a cat's eyes from within that dark mass. Walker was breathing hard, and I could see tears streaming down his cheeks. "What was that?" I said to no one in particular. After hearing his story, my mind conjured all manner of nightmarish fantasies, but nothing approaching logic. I tried to comfort him, but he was shaking his head in his hands, muttering under his breath. After a minute, he started to calm down and looked at me as though he'd forgotten I was there. "Thank you for everything, sir. I really appreciate you listening and buying me that meal and all. I think I'll just stay here till morning and head out. Might even get myself a haircut and a thrift store suit." I asked if he wanted me to stay and give him a ride somewhere, but he waved me off. "You done plenty for me, son. I know my way around this town. I'll find out if my wife still lives around here, and even if she don't, I think I'll stick around a while. Maybe try to salvage something from the wreck of my life. Fresh starts and all that." I could see he wasn't lying, but I also knew he didn't think he'd be doing any of that anytime soon. He looked damned. I gave him what cash I had and made sure he was okay before I left. He tried to smile and look hopeful, but his eyes told me different. I had to leave him there. There was nothing else I could do. I didn't see him again for a few weeks after that night. I hoped he had found his wife and was able to get some sort of closure, but after seeing him again, I don't think that would be possible. I caught a glimpse of him under a streetlight one night, just standing and staring up at my window. He looked disheveled and slack somehow, like he'd lost 40 pounds and was just floating in his clothes. His eyes were just empty dark holes, and I could have sworn I saw a glimmer of something deep inside them. Lately, I've noticed a lot of lost pet signs all over the neighborhood. It seems like every power pole and street sign has at least 2 signs asking about a missing dog or cat. Maybe there are coyotes around here. I could have sworn I heard them howling close by one night. Maybe they killed something nearby. That would explain the terrible smell around here lately. I should warn my girlfriend about them. She's been trying to scare me lately by hiding outside the house at night and calling my name. Maybe I'll go out and surprise her one night. See how she likes it. I work for a real estate company, which sounds boring, I know, but I have the least boring real estate job ever. The company I work for is based in the suburbs of a city that is known for having more abandoned buildings than usable ones. You're probably thinking of the right one, but I don't want to get too specific. Anyway, my company buys abandoned buildings from institutions that can own buildings, but not do much with them, like banks or the state. Then we evaluate them and resell, or gut and scrap them out. This is where I come in. As a fairly active person, I hike, indoor rock climbing, etc., lives in the city. I was always interested in urban exploration. I jumped at the chance to do it legally. I quit my desk job as a loan officer and went to work for the company I work for now. When we acquire new property, we're given an asset assessment sheet, basically a list of anything else that may have come with the property. My job is to enter the buildings and inventory everything inside. I also do some structural checks to see if it's safe for the people to enter, take photos, basic stuff. Let me tell you, it's a lot more interesting than filling out paperwork all day. It pays pretty well too. Since most people with the qualifications I have aren't very interested in exploring rotten buildings where the roof might collapse on you, if you don't fall through the floor first. That's happened to me, by the way. Not a full-on fall, but I've put my foot through a floor during an inspection. I wanted to post about a weird thing that happened on an inspection last week. It's kind of a whole thing, so let me start from the beginning. The new building was pretty average compared to what we usually got, in a part of the city that was well-to-do in the 60s, but had fallen off over time. The kind of area set up like a downtown hub, but no one really goes there. Some of the businesses were still open, but as little markets and dollar stores. The building I was here for had been a bakery in its heyday, with a small apartment on the second floor. From the basic knowledge I had from the file transferred over with the sale, the owner of the bakery had also owned the building and lived in the apartment, with her daughter and grandchildren, after inheriting all of it from her own parents. As the neighborhood went down, she'd paid less and less of her bills until the unpaid property taxes caused the city to repossess. They'd been completely unable to contact her for months, and when they sent the police out to change the locks, they found the place abandoned. The apartment had been empty, the bakery closed. Sad story, but the same story that a lot of the houses in this neighborhood had. The door opened easily enough. I had a crowbar in my car just in case, but I always tried the keys first. We didn't usually do anything crazy like board over the doors and windows, unless there was vandalism, so the daylight shone through the molding white drapes on the windows and lit the place fairly well. The door was nearly flush with the right wall of the building, and along the bank of windows to my left was a small bar, the kind you might sit at with a muffin and coffee, had there been any chairs. Against the back wall was a glass display case, the kind that also functions as a counter that staff stand behind. There was enough space between these two to suggest that this bakery had often had long lines or possibly more seating. The wall beyond that had a faded mural. It was a picture of soft, green hills dotted with houses descending into a sparkling blue sea. Two doves held a banner, possibly telling the name of the bakery or even the location of the mural. I had no idea because it was in Greek. I set my backpack down, took out my phone and started photographing. The windows were all whole in their panes, as well as the glass making up the counter. The counter also still possessed most of the sliding pans that the sweets would have sat on, though everything was covered in a solid layer of dust. It seemed to have been taken well care of while the bakery was active and thankfully not vandalized since. I made my way into the back room through the door behind the counter. It was actually quite small for a shop this size because the ovens had been installed in the basement. The back room had probably been more of a storage area than anything and was empty. The only thing remaining was the dumbwaiter. In the farthest corner of the room was a square hole in the floor, ringed by steel plates. A yellow striped guardrail surrounded it, coming to about knee height. The mechanism that moved the dumbwaiter was exposed, steel beams lining the wall over the hole. I photographed it, planting my feet under the guardrails and leaning in to give a clear picture of the rust starting to form. I pressed my weight onto my palm, leaned into the wall, and my body hovered briefly over the hole. As I did this, I began to feel like someone was in the basement. I looked down into the square, industrial, empty shaft of the dumbwaiter. I saw nothing, even when I pointed my phone's flashlight downwards. I also didn't see the ground of the basement. With the main floor checked, I prepared to move to the basement. The store room had a back door, leading to a small landing. From the landing you could go up to the apartment or down to the basement. There was also a door which led outside to a small stretch of dead grass between buildings. The outside door had a barred window that cast a striped shadow back at me. I rattled the handle of the door, finding it locked. I hadn't shaken the feeling that someone was downstairs. There was no reason, no sound or movement that had caught my attention, but still it was there, a feeling of presence. The front door had also been locked and had opened correctly, meaning that it probably hadn't been messed with. The back door was locked as well as whole. No windows had been broken. There was no way for someone to be down there, but I still had the strongest, down in my guts feeling that someone was in the basement. I turned to the stairs, tamping down my unease. At the end of the day, the most important items in an inspection were the most expensive, and those ovens were the most expensive thing in the building. If I had to guess, they were probably a big part of the reason we bought the building, if not the reason. Despite my nagging idea that I should not go to the basement, there was no way that I could get out of it. The stairs leading to the basement were single wooden slats, suspended horizontally over an open space. The slightly dusty, cold smell of underground spaces wafted up towards me. Even with the daylight shining in through the window, I could only see the first few steps. Shining the lights of my phone only illuminated one more. They seemed to fade into the solid darkness of the basement. I didn't like the look of the steps, and I couldn't quite tell if it was because of the creeps this place had started to give me, or because I was actually seeing something unsafe that my subconscious was warning me about. Before I went on one of my inspections, I had to check in with my boss, and check in again when I left the building. I also had my phone with me at all times to call the office or 911 if I needed help. Even with these precautions, I still didn't want to fall through a set of rickety old stairs and break my leg. I returned to my backpack in the front room and took out a length of rope and a round 10-pound weight. It wasn't the most high-tech way to test the stairs, but it made me feel a lot more comfortable if I could huck a big piece of metal at a step and have it not break. I threaded the rope through the center of the weight, knotted it twice, and tied the other end to my belt. I'd lost a different weight doing this, and now my home set was lopsided. I moved up to the first step, held the weight out at arm's length, and dropped it. It hit the step with a crash, but the wood held. The second and third did as well. I moved along the stairs as I went, and even as I stood on the third stair, the sound of the weight hitting the fourth was strangely muffled. Still, even with my phone tucked into my shirt pocket and casting a light outwards, I could barely see just in front of myself. The darkness was oppressive, like it was alive. That might be an authorial license, but bear with me. By the time I got to the bottom of the stairs, the darkness was thick, the way smoke is. But there was no smell, and it didn't dissipate the way that smoke does when you create airflow. I waved my hand in front of my face to wave the darkness away, but it didn't do anything other than make my hand disappear to slowly dissolve into a haze. The light from my phone only lit the area immediately in front of me. I stepped carefully into the basement. A voice rasped in front of me. I jumped about halfway up the stairs. After I caught my breath, I realized that the sound had been a metallic creak, not a voice. So I had originally thought. I put my palm on the wall to my right and slowly stepped forward. My field of vision stayed consistent at about a foot in all directions. So my plan was to follow the wall in a circle around the room, and hopefully run into the ovens on the way. If I didn't, Then at least I would end up back at the stairs and be able to report that I had tried. The other hand was held out in front of me, and I wove it back and forth like a blind man's cane, so that I wouldn't walk into anything. This failed pretty significantly as I stubbed my toe on a metal plate hovering about an inch off the ground. "Fuck," I said, leaning forward to grab my foot. As I moved closer to the metal plate, I saw the yellow and black striped tape ringing the outside of the square plate, and realized that I had found the moving part of the dumbwaiter. It was secured to the wall with a series of steel pieces and wires that I didn't want to stick my hand into. So instead of hugging the wall, I decided to stay low and let my phone flashlight illuminate the dumbwaiter to be my guide. This half of the dumbwaiter was also in the corner, which made me hope that the basement was similarly proportioned to the tiny back room. I was very tired of waiting around in the darkness. My searching left hand eventually hit the edge of a metal box. I could have shouted with joy because I had finally found the oven. I moved closer, letting the flashlight into my pocket illuminate the silver surface. The light barely reflected back at me, not affecting the omnipresent darkness at all. I felt my way around to the glass doors at the front of the oven, then down. I knelt on the floor to search for the serial number on the underside of the steel box. Cautiously, I made sure not to crawl under, or to place my limbs too close. Wary of the metallic screech I'd heard at the bottom of the stairs, the idea of the oven falling and trapping me underneath made me feel a cold sweat on the back of my neck. I feel like I need to take a moment to explain something. I'm not someone that is often afraid in situations like this. Like I said, I'm a physically fit man, and I do this professionally. I have had close scrapes, injuries, unstable buildings, squatters. I have scars from doing this job, and while I am always aware of potential danger, it is rare for me to feel truly afraid. So when I tell you how terrified I was to be in that basement, you need to understand the magnitude of that. And I was terrified. To my bones, I was afraid, and every minute that I stayed was an act of intense willpower, and only because I wasn't interested in losing my job. I felt the raised letters of the serial number before I saw it. Using my other hand, I took my phone from my pocket and used it to snap a picture. Satisfied, I moved to the second oven. I reviewed the photos after they had been taken, and they were perfectly legible. Curiously, I took a photo with my phone pointing into the empty fog of the basement. In my phone screen, there was nothing but swirling fog until I snapped the picture. As the light briefly intensified with the camera flash, I heard the metal noise again from the far end of the basement. I pulled my phone close to my face and opened the picture. The basement was revealed to be a small brick room, with discoloration around the walls where shelves must have sat. The floor was unpolished concrete, the stairs were suspended by wooden planks, and under them crouched a monster. I froze, feeling disbelief and horror creeping from the pit of my stomach up to my eyes. In the photo, the creature leaned out from a nest of newspaper and fabrics under the stairs. It looked like a bronzed skeleton, except the skull had no eye holes. It rested on 4 arms. The other 2 wound up through the slats of the stairs as if waiting for unwary feet. I tried to swallow and felt my throat click dryly. My vision narrowed to the screen of my phone, while my mind raced. I needed to get out of this basement. The stairs were now a non-option, as I imagined those long, fingered, bronze hands snatching at my ankles. There were no windows. That left only the dumbwaiter. I assumed that the metallic noise I had been hearing was the sound of the creature moving, as if it was rusted over. It had been silent since I had taken the picture, and I prayed that it still thought I was unaware of its presence. I knew, somehow, that the creature was responsible for the darkness. It was only through some quirk of technology that I had seen it at all, and I could only hope that it was unaware of this and would continue to lie in wait for me. Taking a moment to steady myself, I turned back towards the ovens and the dumbwaiter. I moved agonizingly slow. I didn't want the creature to know how afraid I was. It might pounce if it thought I was trying to escape. I stepped onto the metal plate of the dumbwaiter and bounced, as if testing the weight. I wrapped my hands around the largest of the steel shafts holding the plate to the wall and slowly applied pressure to it. There was no way the dumbwaiter was going to work normally. The electricity had been cut off for months, if not years. The shaft was dirty with sooty, black grease, but seemed like it would hold my weight. However, it was quite awkward to grip, and I knew that if I rushed or got careless, I was going to fall. I tried not to imagine myself falling and being trapped in this tiny, dark room with that horrible creature and a broken leg. I took a deep breath, in through my mouth, out through my nose. Even without being able to completely see the walls, I knew that the distance that I needed to climb was only 10 or 12 feet, and I had to put in far more than that on the climbing wall at the gym. Breathe in, breathe out. The steel shaft was bolted into the wall, and the solid steel plate that it was made to move had to weigh at least as much as I did. It could hold me. Breathe in, breathe out. I didn't have any other options. Grabbing the shaft as firmly as I could, I swung my leg up to brace myself against the wall, letting the tension of my body support me. Once I felt secure, I brought my other leg off the ground to rest even higher on the wall. I was bent nearly at the waist, with my knees in my armpits, and I could already feel the pressure in my shoulders, neck, and ankles. It was bearable. Slowly, carefully, I released one hand and moved it up the steel shaft, beginning my walk up the wall. I took a deep breath and another step. It was uncomfortable, but doable. I heard a metallic screech behind me. I nearly stumbled catastrophically, but kept my grip at the last minute. After a deep breath, I continued. The screeches continued behind me in smaller squeaks and crunches, chittering along like some ancient machine coming to life. The noises came slowly, but like any machine, it would be faster soon. I continued my walk up the wall, my lower back screaming, torn between the adrenaline demanding that I run and the diminishing reason left in my mind telling me that a fall would be fatal. The rusted shrieking had begun to even out into a steady whirring, clicking along like an old typewriter. It sounded closer already. I felt a yank around my wrist. My fingers slipped where they gripped the shaft, sliding back through the grease. My heart jumped into my throat and I had to freeze for a moment. My startled lizard brain stopping completely for a moment as it expected my impending doom. When a second pull did not come, I realized that I had made a terrible mistake. The weight I used to test the stairs was still tied to my belt, and it must have caught under the plate of the dumbwaiter. I braced myself and tried to lift my hips, testing my theory, and it held true. I was painfully stuck a few feet from the exit. The clicking behind me crept closer, whirring louder and faster. A dreadful dragging sound accompanied the clicking now. I tried desperately to shut the thought of what that might mean out of my mind. I dragged myself forward, bending my knees until they popped, and jammed my fingertips deep into the thin crack between the shaft and the brick wall. Gritting my teeth, I took my other hand off the shaft. The machine sounds were closer now, that horrible dragging sound nearly underneath me. My left hand fumbled at the knot of rope, but between my growing panic and the grease on my fingers, I couldn't find the end. Click, 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 drag. I shifted my focus to the belt itself, tugging the tongue free and working at the fastener. Click, click, drag. The tongue of the belt came free and dangled uselessly to my side, the knot slipping along the length. Click, drag. My joints screaming, my fingers in agony, I grabbed the shaft again and yanked myself up, praying that the knot would fall the rest of the way off on its own and not send me back down into the darkness. I am not a religious man, but I felt a conversion coming on as I thrust my upper body into that foggy but clearing air above me, my mind a blank and wordless prayer that my belt would give. I felt the side of my belt slip off, and the pressure around my waist suddenly released. I heard myself make a sound like a screamed peal of laughter and shot myself forward. In my desperate hyperextension, my fingers touched the metal plate on the floor of the storage room. I grabbed onto the lip of the hole and dragged myself up until my other hand could reach the guardrail. The clicking sound was now joined with the tapping of metal on metal, like the sound of a rat digging itself out of a wall. I hung suspended, one hand gripped tight to the guardrail, the other on the metal plate. The tips of my fingers scraped raw from the brick walls. From underneath I felt the dumbwaiter and the apparatus supporting it shake. Something impossibly heavy settling its weight onto the metal plate beneath me. The strut I had climbed out on made a popping noise, pulling away from the wall. I shook my head quickly to clear it. Breathe in, breathe out. No time to panic. I swung my lower body up, my abused back muscles screaming. My toes made contact with the floor of the storage room, the side of the open dumbwaiter hole, and skidded off. Pain fluttering up my leg. The strut popped again, pulling further from the wall. That horrible typewriter clicking was louder than ever directly underneath me. Breathe in, breathe out. I swung my body up one last time, my heel connecting with the side of the plate. I pulled my other leg up and swung it onto the floor. My body briefly suspended over the dumbwaiter hole the way you float in the ocean. Head back, chest and hips up. Helpless. I used the last of the strength in my arms to press my body along the floor, sliding feet first into safety. When just my head hovered over the hole, I sat up and lunged across the tiny back room, rolling into the far wall. I watched as the strut I climbed popped and creaked away from the wall, curving forward into the open hole of the dumbwaiter shaft. More metallic noises rose from below, faster, more aggressive. Angry. A wisp of darkness, like smoke, rose into the back room, defiant against the mid-afternoon light streaming in through the barred window. The strut curved farther, collapsing back into itself under the weight, or the strength of the monster, and disappeared into the basement. My breath caught. I scrambled to my feet and ran out of the front door of the bakery. I didn't slow down or stop to look as I grabbed my backpack, closed the door behind me, and got in my car. In a blind panic, I even drove, coming back to myself a few blocks away when my shredded fingers began to bleed down the steering wheel. I stopped feeling the pulse in my hands, my face, my chest, and made a sound I have never made before, and couldn't make again if I tried, like letting all of my terror go in one breath. When I calmed down, I drove back to my office. Keisha, my supervisor, was in the lobby when I pulled up. "Why didn't you check in?" she demanded. Then I watched her eyes widen as she took in my filthy, bleeding hands, my belt hanging off my waist, and whatever expression I was making at the time. The angry boss act dropped immediately and she ushered me back into our shared office. What happened? I told her everything. It came out as she quietly examined my hands, cleaning and bandaging my scrapes with our first aid kit. They were mostly fine, except for a nasty cut at the base of my right thumb, where I must have gotten myself as I released my belt. I think that by the end I was crying, but I'm not sure. All I felt as I spoke was this tired emptiness. At one point, Keisha took my phone and opened the camera roll, calmly looking at the picture of the monster under the stairs. "Okay," she said. "Here's what's happening." She turned the phone towards me so I could watch as she deleted the photo. "I am going to file your report on this. You were able to get into the basement. You could not confirm any of the inventory. After you were in the basement, the stairs collapsed and you had to climb out. You injured yourself while climbing. You're going to take the next week off. The building will be marked unsafe for entry and demoed. We are not going to talk about this again." She held my gaze. "Understand?" "I understand," I said after a long pause. Keisha sighed. "Good. Now go home and get some sleep. Tomorrow, you should see a doctor." And that's what I did. I'm okay. I have scrapes and bruises and muscle strains, but I'm fine. But I needed to get this all off my chest. I can't talk about it to Keisha, and without the picture, I don't think anyone else would believe me. I don't even really care if you guys believe me because I'm scared. It's almost the end of my time off, and I know I'll have to go back out there. The thing is, I didn't lock the door. I ran out so fast that I closed it behind me, but I never locked it. And whatever that thing is, it was too heavy to climb the dumbwaiter shaft, but the stairs were fine. They never even creaked as I walked down them. It might be able to get up the stairs. And the bakery was so taken care of. No one in the neighborhood had bothered it. No graffiti. No one had forced the doors. It seemed lucky at the time, but maybe they knew that it was spoken for, protected. And if that was the case, there wouldn't be a reason to lock the doors, unless you wanted to keep something in. Zuku Valley was more beautiful than the pictures you can find online. It was a great trek, but we were now pretty exhausted after walking back 4 hours. It was almost sunset when we reached the base, and were finally relieved to see our car. No more walking. We had to just drive out from the forest and go back to our hotel in Kohima City. Our guide seemed a bit pissed off since we spent a bit too much time at the top. Then we couldn't keep up the pace coming down, and as a result it was almost dark. We were warned that we needed to be out of the forest before it got dark, but we had barely made it to our car now, and it was still a 30-40 minute drive, winding down from the hilly forest to reach the main road. In some places the roads were so bad that you couldn't go faster than 15 kilometers per hour. As we sat in the car, our guide, who was about 50 years old, said something to our friend Naro in their native language. Naro was the one driving, and the guide sat next to him while Jason, Rajat, and I sat behind. We four were friends through work. Kohima was Naro's hometown that we had come to spend a long weekend primarily for this trek. It seemed the guide was asking Naro to tell us something, but Naro was reluctant to do so. I was too tired to be interested in it, but Jason was the curious one. When he insisted, finally Naro told us about the local myth that the guide wanted us to know. He explained that according to locals, whenever a car passes through these roads at night, something latches onto the car from behind. Almost everyone who has driven here at night felt something holding on to the car from behind. Apparently there is no one alive who has seen it. Anyone who has dared to look back has met with a tragic car accident. For us, it was just another local myth that we didn't care about. Jason tried to make a joke about it, which agitated the guide. He turned around and said to us in broken English, "This is not funny. You look back, we're going to die." The sun was gone now, and it was clear that we were not making it out of the forest before dark. The guide took out his handkerchief and tied it around the back view mirror to cover it. He told something to Naro, who then closed the side view mirror as well. While Jason was the curious one, and Rajat was a hyper-rational one, myth was fine, but acting on them was something that Rajat would not accept. "What are you guys doing? Seriously?" Rajat asked the front seaters. Naro didn't want to argue. We would reach the main road in 10 to 15 minutes. Just play along. We knew Rajat wouldn't play along. Guys, we are educated folks. We cannot follow these false beliefs blindly like idiots. It is true. Every villager has felt. Many have died in accidents. The guide scoffed. Rajat continued to mock Naro. "So Naro, blocking your rear view and side view mirrors reduces chances of an accident or increases it." Jason, too, interrupted, asking Rajat to just chill and let it go, but Rajat continued his debate with the guide and Naro, explaining how if everyone died, who told them that they turned around and saw that thing? I wondered how could these guys even bother to debate about this being so tired after the trek. I soon phased out from the debate. That's when I felt it. I don't know if it was the change in moonlight that entered the car or whether I saw a shadow from the corner of my eye, but I knew there was something behind. Guys, don't look behind, but I think there is someone hanging on to our car from back there. Everyone freaked out. Jason felt it too. Shit. Let's get out of this place. How far is the main road? Rajette still wanted to play rational. It must just be some villager, taking a free ride to the main road. We were so slow, anyone could have hopped and grabbed onto. We were driving a Jeep, the one which has a separate tire behind. It had bars on the back that anyone actually could grab onto. Meanwhile, the guide just kept saying, "Don't look at it." I realized this freaked out Naro. He did look at the rearview mirror with all the commotion happening behind. Fortunately, or unfortunately, they were covered. Just 5 minutes and we'll be out of here. Naro tried to calm us down. Rajette was quiet for a while. I sensed that he wanted to challenge the myth. All he had to do was look behind and he could be proven right about what he had been debating us since the last 10 minutes. He was 99% sure that nothing would happen. It would either be a local villager, or maybe a monkey, or simply nothing but our fears manifested. But he too had the 1% fear of the unknown. Me and Jason sat with our heads down, making sure we didn't even catch a glimpse of it by mistake. Rajette tried to be a bit brave and sat up straight, staring towards the guide, who had his eyes closed, muttering something in native language, probably praying. Naro tried to focus on driving us out of here as quickly as possible. I realized how the fear has made Naro drive faster and recklessly. Could this be the reason for the accidents? Naro asked us to be calm. We're almost there. Just 2 to 3 more minutes and we will reach the main road. I hope whatever it is will leave us alone when we reach there. We could almost see the lights on the main road. There was also the last chance for Rajette to prove the myth as false. I saw him tap his leg nervously, thinking over it. I knew it was tempting for him, but I didn't expect Rajette to actually turn around. Suddenly we heard multiple knocks on the back mirror, and I saw Rajette had turned to look back. I still don't know if it was a reflex to the knock or Rajette trying to prove his point. In fact, I don't know what happened first, the knock or Rajette turning around. The knock made everyone almost jump on their seats. Our heart hammered in our chest. I could only scream, "Rajette, no!" This made the guide look behind and he had a look of instant regret as he turned. All this panic made Naro hit the pedal to accelerate. A bit too fast for that particular turn. We soon felt that our car was tilting towards the right, sliding down. The next second we were upside down, banging our heads against the car roof and each other. Bodies flying and a lot of screaming was the last thing I remembered. I woke up later in the hospital to learn that I was the only survivor from the crash. I wondered whom to blame. Naro for panicking, the guide for scaring us, Rajette for looking back, or that thing that was holding on to our car. The only ones who probably saw that thing were Rajette and the guide. Then why did Jason and Naro die? Did they see it too when the car somersaulted? On our crash site, they also found an unidentified body.